This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Human Action Podcast, joined, as usual, by my co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy, and also by Ryan McMaken, senior editor and economist here at the Mises Institute, in particular because hot off the presses is an article of his this week called How Monarchs Became Servants of the State. So I wanted to talk to Ryan a little bit about that, but also to both of these gentlemen about this phenomenon of monarchs and democracy. One term seems to be on the way out, one term seems to be on the way up, but poorly defined. And I noticed, gentlemen, even as we speak, the line to view the Queen's body at Westminster Abbey stretches for miles in London. And you wonder about the popularity of the Queen, who, although she's just a constitutional monarch, and she doesn't have a lot of real political power, we can get into that, over the English people or the British people more broadly. It's pretty interesting that the monarchy itself continues to endure. In opinion polling, YouGov suggests that about 60 to 65% of Brits support keeping the monarchy. Amongst younger people, of course, that plunges down to maybe 41%, 18 to 24-year-olds. But the fact remains that there's an awful lot of goodwill for this woman. She was a remarkable woman, but a truly remarkable woman, given the amount of time she was queen and what she did personally in terms of self-sacrifice, I think in very noble pursuit of her duties. But nonetheless, in America especially, and in the West today, we think of democracy as the final form of government and that monarchy is this outdated joke. And yet, I'm not sure any American president, even St. Reagan when he died, in modern American history, is going to be venerated like this. And the fact remains that the British people, they could simply ignore this. They could heckle this. They could not cover it on their media. They could actually vote for members of parliament who would take away the roughly £100 million per year that British taxpayers pay to support the royal family, and they don't do these things. So there's something to this, regardless of how enlightened we seem to think we are in the West today.
Yeah, it is a very interesting phenomenon, and I did like Ryan's article on this stuff because he was giving us the tools to sort of unpack, different elements. Like, for example, it seems to me the American public, it's not so much they're fascinated with monarchy, but with the British version of it, right? Because there's plenty of other kings and queens around the world that our tabloids don't, watch everything they do or where their kids up to. So it does seem to be, and I don't know if it's just because we understand English and that's the reason, or if there's something else. So I'm curious, Ryan, since you're the one who made that point. And I was like, oh yeah, like what your thoughts are on why is it that we're so fascinated, or is it just because of our heritage that, it's like you kind of stalk your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend? Is it that kind of thing? What is that?
I think the English language use is a major part of it, and that the monarchs there are harmless and they're fun to watch and pay attention to, and the U.S. hasn't been at war with Britain for more than 200 years, so I think it's safe. I mean, if you think of a contrast, I could think of the Saudi Arabian monarchy, right? Well, that seems to generate less goodwill, and of course, they are not harmless, right? These are active monarchs who are real heads of government as well as being heads of state, who get involved in things like executions and wars and all that sort of stuff, whereas the British monarchy can sit back on a lot of that stuff and let Parliament do most of the dirty work. And you can see that, interestingly, when it's kind of weird how you're shifting whatever you don't like from one side or the other. So somehow the Queen in Ireland gets blamed for all the misdeeds of the British against the Irish, as if Parliament wasn't a major player in that and a major factor in British foreign policy. So I don't understand why that is. And then at the same time in Australia, all of the Republican efforts there to finally free themselves from the Queen, what difference would it make? I mean, Australia is a republic in everything but name. Just because they have this foreign head of state doesn't really, at least not since the 1930s, affect Australian foreign policy much. Any sorts of bonds they have with the United Kingdom do not require this monarch relationship. Just look at the United States. It has an extremely close relationship with the United Kingdom. But yeah, as far as the U.S. following goes, I think it is this Anglosphere, this kind of feeling of a common culture among all the English-speaking countries who have this common British heritage to some extent.
But this fascination with the Queen, though, it suggests that people do want something bigger than themselves in their life. I mean, certainly the UK is probably even more secular than the United States, apart from the Muslims, of course, in the UK. But overall, I would argue that Great Britain, even with the Catholic influence in Ireland, is less religious and exhibits less religiosity, less church attendance overall than the United States. I mean, the Church of England is almost a secular institution at this point. So I think libertarians fall down on the job at this. They say, well, democracy is the be-all, end-all, or that individualism is the be-all, end-all. Well, people don't act that way.
And even in our culture, like we see it with Disney movies and things like there's something magical or whatever about a monarchy, or Arthur pulling Excalibur out of the stone. If he became now prime minister, that wouldn't be the ring of now he's King Arthur or whatever. And so that I'm not endorsing it or whatever. I'm still a good anarcho-capitalist and so forth, but there does seem to be this magic, or even like how with JFK and all that, how they called it Camelot and whatever. So they were kind of saying he's not merely a president. There's something about this man and his family, and it's royal. And so for whatever reason, and maybe people would just say, oh, that's because we were taught that framework and it really is silly. But it does seem that this fascination goes beyond. They're not celebrities the same way the Kardashians are. There does seem to be something else, even if officially we say, oh yeah, we believe in democracy and so forth. Americans do seem to go back to, again, looking at the cultural things. They like stories about kings and queens and stuff. It wouldn't, those old fairy tales wouldn't ring true. They wouldn't be as entertaining if they were about a democratically elected head of state.
I mean, a fair amount of this is probably due to this particular monarch. However, I mean, Queen Elizabeth's pretty good at annoying people, at doing things to make people dislike the monarchy, and has been extremely successful, I think, in that regard. Will that goodwill be extended to other monarchs? I don't know in the future. Certainly in the past, when monarchs were daily players in real politics, they were much more divisive figures. And we can, of course, point to monarchs who had their heads cut off by the English. Yeah, he wasn't Charles I was not universally hated, but he certainly wasn't universally loved, and enough of the country disliked him to support either tacitly or actively the actual abolition of the monarchy after that. So, but as time goes on and the monarchs pass more and more into the background, they do seem to become more and more beloved. And I wonder if the U.S. had a similar figure where it was sort of a elder statesman who only sat in the background and maybe tried to offer some advice or conducted state dinners, that sort of thing. I wonder if you'd be able to capture a similar sort of goodwill. Would you call that person a king? I don't know. You could invent a position like that. I was thinking about how would you invent a monarch for the U.S. Now, of course, I would be against any sort of monarch for the U.S. overall. Maybe different parts of the U.S. could have some sort of figure like this. And I was thinking about the Dutch Republic, where they essentially invented a monarch slowly with during their secession effort from the Habsburgs. They had this position called the stadtholder, who was essentially this warlord of sorts, who was elected by various parts of the Netherlands to oversee the war effort and to provide some sort of defense from foreign enemies. That became, based on the prestige of that person, a hereditary position, but only after a long time did it come to be regarded as a king, as a sort of royal. And so you could probably do the same sort of thing in a decentralized place, similar to the U.S. or in the U.S., but we're talking centuries, right? You can't just install a king in that situation. But you can create, I think, people who come to be regarded as monarchs. I mean, how did it happen in the past? You had someone who was just one guy among a bunch of competitors, and he managed over time to gain more prestige and more power, and then came to be regarded as a monarch, and that works. But of course, we're talking about a time frame that's much longer than 20, 30, 40 years.
Well, you raise a good point there, Ryan, that I guess we'll get to see right now. I mean, not that it's literally a controlled experiment, but taking Elizabeth out and now having Charles come in where he's, he said all kinds of creepy stuff about Princess Diana back in the day, just weird, like real aloof and just weird things. And then, he's in bed with Klaus Schwab and all that. So we'll see what the treatment is afforded to him. And maybe that will help us distinguish, like you say, how much of this is because the monarchy over there now is relatively toothless versus she was just a nice lady and an upstanding and a good role model. And that's why she got, the public has this outpouring of affection for her now.
Yeah, imagine if Elizabeth had been doing what Charles was doing for the last 20 years, was flying around the world in her private jet and lecturing the plebs about reducing their carbon footprint. I wonder if Charles will continue that as monarch. I suspect maybe someone will tell him to cut that out now that his job description is considerably different, but we'll see.
Well, Ryan, I want to talk about the thesis of your article, which explains, for example, why Elizabeth was toothless in the political sense of it. And basically you say that beginning in the medieval period, monarchs through gunpowder and exchangeable money and other things started to expand their power, expand their wealth, expand their ability to wage war and conquer foreign territories. And as this expanded, they needed to create a bureaucratic class to administer their newfound lands or their newly conquered subjects. And as this bureaucracy expanded by necessity, it became something unto itself that ultimately elbowed the monarchs themselves to a ceremonial role. So how, give us a little background on this. How did this happen?
Well, I think when a lot of people talk about the ideal of a monarch who had to deal with a very decentralized system, who based his property on, or based his rule on just the ownership of private property, Rothbard notes this in his History of Economic Thought, that your medieval monarchs, their revenues are based on rents, tolls, exchange, voluntary exchange sorts of situations where of course, they didn't necessarily acquire all that property through peaceful means, but at that time and place, it had been acquired, they were managing it, and they didn't attempt to use it to therefore just decide that everyone in the surrounding areas or everyone within his territories just starts paying him a quarterly or an annual tax of sorts. That was a new thing that developed later. I think that's what when someone like a Rothbard or me looks on a monarch and sees that's a relatively harmless form of monarchy, and in fact can actually be beneficial in the sense of there's a real clear distinction between what the monarch is doing and what the public views as its own interests, and there's a back and forth that restrains the power of the monarch, so that cities, they want to be left alone, and so they get something like German town law where the monarch's rules did not apply, and he just let them do their own thing, provided they didn't run off and join some other king in warfare. But as monarchs became stronger and they had the potential to actually make more demands on people, they were more than happy to do it. And so as they had more resources at their disposal, they started hiring people then to enforce the laws they wanted to see. They started to have actual tax agents instead of tax farmers. That is, people who would have been directly controlled by the regime to collect revenue. They started to really wage war, both literally and figuratively, against the nobles who, in a feudal system, in school, you're showed this pyramid about feudalism and the kings at the top, and then there's these nobles in the middle, and then everybody at the bottom, as if the king just handed down orders and kind of filtered out and everybody did what they were supposed to do. That's not really how it worked. In a feudal system, your independent nobility, they had their own thing. They had a lot of discretion, a lot of independence, and the king really had to ask them real nicely to do things, that is, to give them troops, to give them revenue. And so the situation was just extremely decentralized, extremely different, but that changed in the modern era when the monarchs really started to build states because they could do so. They started to become wealthy enough that was possible. And so then they subjugated the other nobles, they subjugated the church, they subjugated all of the competing organizations, and they built up around themselves what we came to be called states. So states rose up in really potentially as early as the 14th century, but really noticeably and in a way that's undeniable in the 17th century. And that's when you get the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that basically says, this is the international order now. The world is composed of states. Well, Europe is composed of states now, and we recognize these territorial states and we respect their boundaries, and that's how everyone's going to interact now among kings and other heads of state. So by then, you're just so way beyond a situation where kings are just one among equals, where they're peers among the nobles. They're now leaders of states, as we think of in the common parlance today. So they collect taxes, they enforce their rule, they do terrible things against those who are disagreeable towards state edicts. And I just wanted to make sure with that article that when we use the word monarch, we're not using it to just merge together all these different types of monarchy that existed from the 8th century up until the 19th century. These were very different types of governments, different types of states, different types of arrangements that existed. And so it's important to make those distinctions.
And so what's interesting, that like one implication of that is if we're talking about a more old school monarchy where they happen to own a lot of the land, and then like you say, now how did they acquire that property that could have been through non-libertarian means? But given that they are the recognized owner of the land, and they can say, yeah, tenant farmers come here and you have to pay me, whether it's in crops or eggs or whatever. And, you can exchange military service or what have you for an exchange for me letting you live on what's my land. It does make sense then, too, that who gets to take over that when the king dies? Well, his oldest son or whatever, just because because if it's property, then you don't just give it's not that there's a vote to decide who gets Bill Gates stock when he dies. Presumably he's going to give it to people of his choosing. So a lot of the stuff that seems crazy about how a monarchical system works makes more sense if you realize its origin in that sense.
And while you wouldn't describe it as democracy in the modern sense, there actually was a lot of what you would call electoral politics going on in this time period. So when you did have someone like the emperor in the Holy Roman Empire, he had to convince others to vote for him, that there were electors, that there were situations where he had to gain the approval and essentially the vote of people in his region. And this, of course, also coincided with the rise of local parliaments in many parts of Europe, from Poland, Spain. France had the Estates General. And so monarchs did rely on buy-in from people who earlier in the period were considered essentially equals, who had a say, who had to give their consent to some sort of war or revenue-raising scheme that the king wanted to do. That actually went into decline over time, so that the kings became much more absolutist, and the king himself became associated with everything that the state was doing instead of this more decentralized process where you did have bodies that we might call legislative elected bodies to a certain extent, or representative bodies. But those really only managed to hang on and grow their own influence in a linear, nonstop fashion for the most part. There were some setbacks, but that really only happened in England, where you had those same sorts of bodies really go into decline on the continent for the most part. That may have been due to the exigencies of war, that maybe they just kept handing more and more power to the monarchs because they saw ground-based, land-based threats from neighbors in many cases, whereas the English benefited from the fact that they were islands and were somewhat separated from what was going on the continent.
Well, Ryan, I would like to point out that really up until the Industrial Revolution, almost everything we thought of as wealth in this world of ours meant land, or the fruits therefrom. So when we look back on monarchy as this puzzling thing, or we look back on feudalism as this puzzling thing based on our current view of the world, I think we forget that there weren't real capital markets until, let's say, the late 19th century, early 20th century. I mean, other forms of wealth, whether that, stock ownership or partnership interests or whatever it might be, those didn't really exist. I mean, land was it. Land was how you were wealthy. And even today, we talk about all the land the Queen of England owned.
That's right. And that's also a very primitive economy, is when it's all just based on agriculture, and people tend to be very poor in those situations. And this is often a point that needs to be made about Europe under monarchs also, is that people's image, of course, of the Middle Ages is that a lot of people were very, very poor. And of course, they were. And all you have to do is watch some Monty Python skits or something like that, and you're reminded about just how awful life was in terms of the actual wealth you controlled in the 13th century. The question is, was that due to monarchy? Or was it just due to the fact that there was no capital accumulation in that time period? Because you had deurbanization in late antiquity, wealth went away, it went into steep decline. You had a series of plagues. These were all problematic for wealth accumulation. And then it built up over time. And historically, you can see how interest rates went into steep decline. Beginning in the late Middle Ages, but this came after a period where people were able to have a real surplus and save, and that's why you had people get richer. That's what enabled the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't the fact of we managed to get rid of these horrible kings from the past, and then everybody suddenly became richer. Your political system had not that much to do with it because they weren't really capable of controlling trade very much anyway. And so states were weak. The amount of economic development you had was able to take place without a whole lot of state control. Also facilitated by the fact that principalities are so small that any prince who wanted to really tax the hell out of somebody and really start to regulate his economy, it was relatively easy if you were a merchant to move your capital and to move your goods down the river to a competing prince's territory where he might be more than happy to have productive citizens like that. And so there was a lot of competition then for productive citizens in the cities and in competing territories, and that helped as well. And that actually was made worse in the period of consolidation where you had states grow large and then they started to get all these democratic institutions. That was working against economic development in many cases.
Well, that's a good point. And maybe you've seen this stuff too, Ryan, in some of the economic history literature to try to explain, like, why is it that, for people who haven't seen the chart of like per capita wealth, over the centuries is just flat. And then all of a sudden, 1700s or so just explodes upward. And why is that? And it happened in Europe, and why? And, they say, well, the rule of law and things like this. But then you say, okay, but why? Why was that recognized there and not, in China or something is to the same degree? And people felt like, if you start a business, you get to keep it and the ruler can't just come and confiscate stuff. And they mentioned what you said there, that for various accidental reasons in terms of history, that the nobles couldn't, there was like the Magna Carta and whatnot, that nobody could really consolidate power very easily in the Middle Ages. And so you had all these fractured power centers, and that's why people could vote with their feet. So yeah, if any one little area got too tyrannical, everybody would leave. And so because of that competition that kept, what we would say like oppressive government to relatively in check. And then that spawned, what we consider individual liberty, rule of law, and so forth. And then, there you get the Industrial Revolution because of those, institutional prerequisites where it happened to be in place, not merely because they got John Locke or something. That, there was a reason that you had these other things in place. And that's why what we think of as individual liberty happened to emerge in Europe. So I don't know if I endorse that full story, but that is an element of it, just that this competition among the powerful people for various geographical reasons and whatnot that happened in Europe. That's partly why Europe got so rich and kind of took over the world.
Well, if nothing else, the preponderance of monarchs in Europe didn't prevent the Industrial Revolution from taking off.
Right.
Right. And you had, of course, in England and Northwest Europe and in Northern Italy, you had the rise of banking, you had the rise of financial structures, you had of course, the textile mills all came into being under strong monarchies in a period from, say, even the 15th to the 18th century. So, yeah, you can't claim that the existence of monarchy prevented that. There was clearly something else going on.
Well, there are a couple of articles of faith in the West today. One is that democracy is an unmitigated good, even though that term is used vaguely, and how democracy works in practice can be as different as Ryan points out a monarchy in 1300 versus, let's say, 1800. So we don't exactly know what people mean by democracy per se, other than it's good, and it's a synonym for good, and it's the fullest and final expression of governance because that equals consent of the governed. That seems a specious claim, but nonetheless, it's claimed frequently. And second is amongst progressives, this is an absolute article of faith, and I mean progressives of all political stripes, is that if there weren't all these greedy, bad people spreading misinformation or lying to the media or controlling social media or controlling messaging, if people could simply get the truth, and if everyone participated in our sacred democracy, in other words, if voter turnout was very high, we, meaning progressives, would always win. The only reason we don't win every election overwhelmingly is because these bad people and disinformation, voter suppression, and right-wing narratives and right-wing control of media, et cetera. I mean, these two things are absolute articles of faith among progressives today. So I'm not so sure I buy either one. And I'm not so sure that democracy per se is, in and of itself, always better than a monarchy. And of course, Hoppe talks about this at length. So let's have Bob's case.
Well, sure. And so here, it's what I think, let's not be quite a lot of people, they can't stand Hoppe's book and they go and find, something in a footnote on a certain page. But if you actually sit down and read his argument, he brings up things that are like, oh yeah, never thought of it that way. So for example, and these aren't necessarily original to him, but for example, back when, if it's acknowledged that there's the head of state and they're there because of their birthright or, bloodlines, not because the people elected them, well, then there is this distinction. And so if the kings decide to go to war with each other, it's not as if each nation thinks, oh, now it's, the English versus the French. It's like, no, our kings are going to war. And so it tend to limit total war. And that's why, the military conflicts in the Middle Ages were not nearly as devastating and totalitarian as they would be like in World War I, for example. And so I think, a lot of people point to Napoleon as sort of a turning point where it all of a sudden became the nation going to war, and then the other ones felt they had to reciprocate. And so there's that element as well. Also, too, you just think about it. There's a lot of things, just look at the U.S. system, where once one party gets in power, they do all sorts of short-sighted things that are, immediately give payouts, but squander the long-term wealth of the nation, let's call it. And it can be something trivial, like if you go and look at the contracts that the people who manage forests that they give to people, like they come and just log like crazy, like they don't maintain the long-term health of the forest the way a privately owned forest would do, right? And it's just little things like that, just to give an example of what I mean. And so why is it? Well, because you don't know if you're a regime and you get elected, for all you know, the voters are going to throw you out and put somebody else in. Whereas if you're a monarch and your son is going to inherit the throne and then his son and so forth, you can engage in long-range planning and do things that make sense in the long run to maximize, the wealth of the kingdom. So just things like that it's not obvious, as you say. And, another thing too, would you want to pick your babysitter based on an election, or to say what mechanic is going to change the brakes in my car? Would you want to have that up for a vote? And most people say, no, that'd be insane. Of course not. And yet a lot of people are saying, oh, but clearly the way to decide who is in charge of our military and court system, that should be up to a popular election, even though you would never in a million years want your babysitter to be picked through that same mechanism.
Well, I think also some of the key issues here are the rise of this idea that the regime itself and the people are one and the same, and that the people somehow control the regime, which is never true. And the classical liberals developed before the Marxists developed liberal exploitation theory. They understood that there's the productive class and there's the government class, and they're always in conflict. In fact, I ran an article today by Gustave de Molinari, who's classical liberal, radical liberal, laissez-faire cred has never been questioned. And he says essentially these same things about monarchy and democracy. is that monarchy had its benefit in two ways, right? Just what Bob was saying, for the potential of long-term thinking about the actual capital present within the polity, the kingdom, whatever. And then, but the downside then of democracy is the short-term thinking, and also this idea that, well, gee, we're not separate from the people who collect the taxes. We're not separate from the regime, which is using our resources in ways that we may not actually approve. That's, of course, always true when Congress spends your money, when Parliament spends your money. But people have been brainwashed into this idea that, well, I voted for whoever's in there, or I actually voted against who won the last election in Congress, but somehow that person represents me, even though I didn't even want them to be my representative. So we just sign off on all of that stuff that they're doing because we bought into this idea of it's the national will. It's they represent us. Whereas at least before the days of constitutional monarchy, you didn't buy into that idea. You recognize there was a real divergence of interests, and there was a real advantage there. That didn't say that monarchs were especially virtuous or wonderful people or adhered to some sort of higher moral law. It just recognized that the problem of popular government abolished this very necessary view against the regime as your exploiter.
Well, and Hoppe also makes the point that in a hereditary monarchy, the next in line may well be a dunce. He may well even be malevolent. But in democracy, we guarantee dunces and malevolent actors because of the nature of the office. In other words, how you obtain democratic office and how you keep it requires basically a degree of criminality, avarice, amorality, however you want to view it. So, look, I don't think America, just in its nature, in our founding, apart from the English, could ever be a monarchy. I wouldn't want that. Some people wanted George Washington to be a king, of course. We should remember that. But the idea that mass democracy is better. I mean, let's talk about a couple examples. I mean, there's very few what we might call pure or absolute democracies left on Earth. Most of them are either constitutional monarchies, what we call mixed monarchies, but no good right libertarian can ever go more than an hour without bringing up Liechtenstein. So I'll bring up Liechtenstein. Here we have Hans Adam II, who wrote a brilliant book called The State in the Third Millennium, which you should read. He's obviously a very caring guy. It's a very wealthy country, so their governance problems are different than a lot of countries. And his son, Alois, is now basically heading up, practically speaking, the monarchy, although Hans Adam is still the prince. But he retains, for example, veto powers over anything passed by the parliament. And this came up in a referendum to the constitution of the country in 2003, and it survived. So at the time, there was a bill afoot in the parliament to, I guess, more openly legalize abortion, and there was some opposition to this, and so they wanted to maintain this veto power on Hans Adam II because a lot of people didn't want this abortion bill to pass. It turned out it didn't pass, but nonetheless, that strikes me as pretty interesting that we still have an example like in Liechtenstein. You may remember, when we talk about a figurehead or someone in a ceremonial role with no legislative power, the Japanese emperor Akihito, after the Fukushima disaster back in 2011, remember, he was very prominent publicly trying to calm people down. And then a year or so later, he gave a talk where he was actually quite worried about the potential health impact of the Fukushima fallout. And because that was contrary to the official government position, that talk was heavily edited and suppressed somewhat. So that's an example of a monarch going sideways with the underlying actual political class. And, just Googling around today, apart from a few Muslim monarchies, that perhaps the most absolute monarchy left in the world today is Vatican City. And the Pope need not even be a resident. Francis is a sometime resident, but he is basically the old-fashioned absolute ruler of that square kilometer, whatever Vatican City is. So there's still examples out there where these vestiges play some role in what actually happens politically.
Yeah, those are all good points. And I just want to stress the thing you said in the beginning there, Jeff, to make sure the listeners caught that was and this is one of Hoppe's points, is that we're under a democratic system in general. Like Hayek has a famous chapter in The Road to Serfdom saying why the worst get on top, and especially the more powerful the state is, that just attracts people that are not the kind of people you want ruling over others. That people who actually would be good rulers don't seek it out. And whereas, like you say, in contrast, if it just happens to be the king's oldest son or whatever is the one who is in charge, once in a while you might get lucky and it'll be somebody good.
Well,
and
you
maybe
might get
feel a sense of duty.
Hans Adam II.
Yeah, or my favorite example would be that back in the day that the emperor of the Habsburg Empire picked Karl Menger to tutor his son, who was at the time next in line. So that's kind of takes foresight to say, oh, I'm going to pick Karl Menger to be the guy that goes around and tutors my son. Like that's from my perspective, obviously a very good choice. And so once in a while you will get that. Whereas I don't imagine that Joe Biden, when he was thinking about Hunter, was going to go grab an Austrian economist and have him tutor him. Right. So just examples like that where you can see that, yes, there were people in history that were good. They're good kings and bad kings kind of thing.
Has Prince Charles reached out to you, Bob?
No, not yet.
Okay.
And if it did, it'd probably be guys coming at night dressed in black.
Okay.
Well, this is, I don't know if this counts as a side issue, but we've run a couple of articles on Mises.org about the potential superiority of dispensing with elections and having representatives just chosen by lot, right? Where if you would have a hard time convincing me that choosing members of Congress just by drawing names out of a hat would produce lower quality than the people who run for office and get elected. You might say, well, those people, they're not knowledgeable. Well, I mean, how naive do you have to be to think that Mitch McConnell's the most knowledgeable, virtuous person that Kentucky could come up with in order to send to the U.S. Senate? It's I just don't find that a compelling argument for why you need elections at all. But it kind of illustrates, right? Sure, you could get a moron through that system, but you could also get a very good person as well. And I think there was some recognition that life is wild, weird things happen. A hierarchical monarchy is just as good as a variety of other systems we might choose in terms of picking leaders. But somehow we decided that people who really, really want to have positions of political leadership are the ones who should have it. And that doesn't seem like a particularly wise position either.
But back to our point at the beginning of the discussion, you think people just need something? I mean, the West doesn't have a real good answer to what replaces God. The West has decided that we are going to be secular. And whether you like it or not, America is marching in a very secular direction, especially in terms of actual religious observation, church attendance, etc. So once you accept that, I mean, it already appears that Prince Charles has gotten quite a boost in his popularity numbers just out of sympathy for the Queen's death. Now that he's actually king, people are looking at him and all that weird stuff with Camilla, and he wasn't very nice to Diana, and he's always been kind of jug-eared and not a playboy like Andrew, but a little goofy, and always under the shadow of his mother for so long. But now that he's king, I think people are already looking at him differently. So maybe there's just something deep in the human psyche that we're innately hierarchical. And if we're not going to have God, we're going to have politicians of all things. And so, compared to Boris Johnson or Tony Blair, Queen looks pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to make the obvious point, like I am a Christian, and that's one of the titles given to Jesus. He's the king, and so there is a sense in which, like, I somewhat tongue-in-cheek say, "Oh, I'm a monarchist," in the sense that I have a king. So yes, if you're of that worldview, then, or famously in the Old Testament, the Jewish people wanted a king to be like the other nations, and God warned them, like, no, you don't, trust in me, you don't want them, and the king's going to tax you and do all this. And they said, yeah, we want a human king. So yes, clearly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is this idea that there is humans can't just be master of their own domain. They do long for somebody to be ahead, and just, you don't want it to be another human. It should be God. That's what makes sense. So I realize atheists are going to reject that, but if you're a Jewish person or a Christian person, then that's going to resonate with you.
I do think people gravitate to that idea. and that's covered in a book by Benedict Anderson called Imagined Communities. It's about the rise of nationalism. And he talks about how the Enlightenment, which had many, many downsides in terms of overturning the idea of the old Christian polity and replacing it with the secular state, was a major factor in the Enlightenment. And so ridding Europe then of the old idea of the religious community as the unifying force enabled this idea, or rather drove a lot of people to needing the idea of something else that would seem permanent, that when I'm on my deathbed, I know I'm about to leave this world, but boy, at least France will endure forever, right? At least my community will be here for thousands of years. Probably a naive view in itself, but I think it was explored in the idea of the Enlightenment and this replacement community for the old religion community that had gone into steep decline after the Renaissance. And so, yeah, I do think it does fulfill that idea. It replaced Christendom. It replaced the idea of me as a Christian, I have common cause with someone in the Holy Land or in Christian Alexandria. Let's say it's the 5th century. And even though I'm in Lyon in France, we all share this community. Well, that was, of course, abolished with the rise of the nation states and nationalism. So I have nothing in common with those people anymore. But boy, now I have this other community, my fellow Frenchmen who might be a different religion, completely different social class, but we have that French bond. And Anderson's point was that bond is largely completely invented and not even necessarily part of human nature if we look further into the past, but it does serve definitely a purpose.
Well, I think we have those bonds today coalesce around things like feminism and social justice activism, Black Lives Matter, climate change. People still want something, because when you erode institutions, and a lot of them deserve to be eroded, when you take away nationalism, which you did with the European project, the EU, what do you get? Well, you literally get, in the UK, for example, you get football hooligans painted up in the colors of their team from their town. They'll literally get on a train and travel 100 miles to another football team's town and get off the train and mix it up in the streets and have a melee with the other team's fans, because they got to have something, right? Their team, their identity with their town, the colors, the face painting, the whole thing. It's all like a tepid modern version of Braveheart or something. It's just who are we and what are we about? And I think the left is starting to understand this and play this better. The right, especially in the 20th century, if you said, well, what are we about? They'd say, well, we're about God and country and family. But as those things fell away, the right doesn't have much left. Well, we're for tax cuts, or we're for less immigration, or whatever it might be. Whereas the left has a raison d'etre. The left can say, we are for, eliminating racism. That is our quest. We are for eliminating inequality. I mean, to me, those are pretty shoddy things to imagine you're living for, because I think progressivism is a false doctrine that just benefits a few people at the top. But nonetheless, it's something. And as Gary North used to say, no progressive, something beats nothing. So I think the two sides, the two ugly sides which are coalescing right now in the United States, are both starting to figure that out and reach for that something. So the Queen was a something. She was a somebody, and she's gone now. And I guess Charles is going to be half somebody. But, I wonder about the future of England. I wonder if 20 years from now we will have William, or by that time the Brits will say no more.
Well, yeah, I think you make a good point there, Jeff, that the left certainly has benefited, call it identity politics or what, they have their causes, and then, people have a sense of belonging in certain communities, and that's all literally celebrated. There's entire months devoted to particular segments of it. And then the right So I think you're right, Jeff, that like they're somewhat flat-footed and tone deaf and just stuck in their ways that, well, a capital gains tax cut, that's the way to fix this problem up, in Reaganomics. But also in defense of or in fairness, with if the alt-right starts copying those tactics, I mean, the one group of people who are not allowed to be proud of who they are, white Christian men, let's say. Like, not only are you not allowed to say, like, you're a monster if you did say that you are proud of your heritage or your race or something. You know what I mean? Like, that's demonstrable proof that you're a bad person. And so they can't really copy those tactics because that's been ruled inadmissible and, get booted out of polite society. So it is sort of a rigged game. Just to see how this plays out, it's clear in retrospect why the left is just completely conquered culturally.
Identity politics is a dead end, and it's a bad idea. But the people who push it can hardly be excused or act shocked if a white identitarian movement grows. Frogs and red MAGA hats. I mean, that's just the nature of the universe. But Brian, why don't we wrap it up with you? I mean, give us your take on is something going to come along and replace democracy as the god today, or is this only go in one direction and we're just heading towards a more progressive future the way they define it?
Well, I'm hopeful in believing some of the scholarship on states as an institution, and that the states since 1945 have really started to go into decline in some sense, and it's part of.
Do you mean nation states?
Nowadays they are nation states because people have imbued states with this idea of national identity.
Okay.
But yeah, the idea of the state as this organization with a monopoly on the means of coercion, right? So not talking about the U.S. state, just the idea of the sovereign state as a unified political entity. And we have started, the fact that we see more and more talk about secession, that we see more and more talk about international trade, about integrating into international organizations, which oftentimes are bad when they're trying to forge new megastates of their own. Nevertheless, they can also be beneficial in that they undermine the state itself and might actually cause more of a give and take in terms of which organization is allowed to have prerogatives in this situation versus that situation. So whereas once there was, in say 1950, there was no organization that could even remotely challenge the state, the idea of breaking up states into smaller pieces was regarded as bizarre, silly, harmful, terrible, which is why the idea of territorial integrity became basically gospel at the UN after World War II, is that these are the world's borders, they shall never be changed, and anyone who tries to change them will be considered a horrible aggressor or some sort of purveyor of civil war who must be put down. And you're starting to see the international community maybe start to soften a little bit on the idea that you could break up a state into smaller pieces. And so you see that in Scotland, you of course see it in Spain. And so I think some movement is occurring in that direction. What does that have to do with democracy? It's relevant in the fact that decentralized democracy works much better than centralized democracy. And so if you had, say, a state where the actual central government was composed of pieces that were sending representatives or delegates based on local interests, then that would be altogether different than, say, a unitary state like France, where everybody gets together and they vote on this one big mega parliament, and then it's all decided what is the national will, what should we be doing for the nation. Whereas, say something more along the Swiss model, or as what the United States was originally supposed to be, where you had to have different organizations, different territories, different sovereign entities come together, negotiate amongst themselves as to how revenues were going to be spent, what was going to be tolerated in terms of the power of the central government. That only works when you have a lot of more local-based organizations start to demand their own sort of sovereignty, their own sort of independence. And some countries recognize that. Some countries have moved into that direction. Some countries even split up, as the Czech Republic did as Czechoslovakia did in the early 1990s, where it was recognized we could no longer carry on in this federal relationship with these two distinct entities. But sometimes they manage to hold themselves together for a long time. Democracy would still be considered a thing in those cases, but it would be very, very different. To have extremely decentralized states is a completely different type of democracy than a unitary democracy. And so that would just be a big improvement of its own. But if you wanted to actually really start to put some barriers in the way of just this public will and majoritarianism being able to do whatever it wanted, I think you could actually use monarchy to serve a useful role in that. Now, in most constitutional monarchies today, the monarchy is way too eviscerated. It has way too little power. It just does really whatever the parliament says. If you really wanted to change things, you would go backward in the sense of you would want then the monarch to have a real explicit veto, say in England, instead of sort of this English constitution where we don't really know what the monarch's powers are, and I don't know what influence the monarch exists behind closed doors with the PM. The monarch should have a real veto to simply say, this is terrible legislation and I think it's bad for the community, so I'm just going to veto it. If you wanted to, you could have some sort of 3/4 vote as an override or whatever, but that would prevent a lot of terrible legislation. You would also then have to separate, however, the finances of the monarchy from the state. And I've seen a lot of criticism of Charles III. Hey, look, Charles III just inherited $56 billion estate or whatever the value is, but he's not taxed on it. The reality is Charles doesn't own that. That's if Parliament decided to run Charles out of England and install a different monarch or no monarch, Charles would not get to keep that stuff. That's not really his property. It's really the property of Parliament, of the English state. So you would have to get to a situation where the monarch was really his own thing and he had to finance himself and his property was completely separate and he really did represent a separate part of the country, something distinct from the English state. And so that would be a step in the right direction. It, of course, would not give the guy absolute power in any way. Parliament would still exist, but it would then provide a way for there being some sort of backstop, some sort of institution that was truly separate from the state. But short of that, where if the monarch just kind of goes on appointing as PM whoever the people voted for, I just don't see much of a role there, and that probably will then just lend itself toward people waking up one day and deciding, hey, what do we need this guy for? It doesn't actually do anything, so we'll get rid of him.
Well, that might be the question of the 21st century, whether these big states break up into smaller constituent parts. And as a matter of fact, Ryan has a book coming out later this year. It's I think, tentatively titled Breaking Apart, and it makes the case for smaller political entities and subdivisions. So look, keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, we'll provide a link to his article this week, How Monarchs Became Servants of the State, and of course a link to Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. If you haven't made time to read that, I think it's an absolute must read for everybody. So all that said, I want to thank Bob and Ryan for joining, and ladies and gentlemen, have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.